After decades of doing this, I've learned that the most dangerous lies in this world aren't the ones told with malice or greed. The most destructive deceptions are the ones wrapped in the velvet of protection. People come onto my stage every day and they tell themselves stories to survive their own reality. But there's a specific kind of tragedy that happens when a parent decides that their child's independence is a threat to their own emotional stability. That's exactly where I found Sarah. When I first met Sarah backstage, she looked like someone who had spent her entire life trying to disappear into the upholstery. She was 24 years old, but she moved with the hesitant, jerky uncertainty of a much younger girl. She wouldn't meet my eye. Every time I asked her a direct question, her gaze would slide over to her mother, Martha, who was sitting right there next to her, clutching Sarah's hand so tight her knuckles were turning a ghostly shade of white. Martha was the one who reached out to us. She told my producers that Sarah was losing her mind, that she was being groomed by a dangerous man she met online, and that Sarah was suffering from a litany of psychological disorders that made it impossible for her to function in the real world. Martha had this mama bear persona down to a science. She was articulate, she was tearful, and she presented herself as the only thing standing between her fragile daughter and a cold, predatory world. But I've been around the block enough times to know that when someone works that hard to convince you how sick someone else is, they're usually trying to hide their own symptoms. I looked at Martha, then I looked at Sarah, and I didn't see a mother and a daughter. I saw a jailer and a prisoner who had been told the bars were there to keep the monsters out rather than to keep her in. I sat down with them in that small, sterile green room before the cameras were even hot. I wanted to see the unfiltered version of their dynamic. Martha started talking immediately, a mile a minute, listing every episode Sarah had ever had. She talked about Sarah's weak heart, her social phobia, and her inability to process complex emotions. It was a grocery list of incapacities, and the whole time, Sarah just sat there nodding like a puppet. I've seen this movie before, and I know how it ends if we don't change the script. I leaned in, ignored Martha for a second, and asked Sarah one simple thing. What do you want, Sarah? Not what does your mother want for you, but what do you want for yourself? The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She looked at Martha, terrified, and Martha didn't miss a beat. She squeezed Sarah's hand and said, "She wants to be safe, Dr. Phil. She just wants to be home where I can take care of her." I held up a hand to stop Martha. I looked Sarah right in the eye and I told her, I didn't ask the spokesperson, I asked the woman. That was the first time I saw a spark of something in Sarah's eyes. It wasn't hope yet. It was just a flicker of recognition that someone actually saw her as a separate human being. As we started digging into the backstory, the picture Martha had painted began to crack at the edges. They lived in a small, isolated town in the Midwest. According to Martha, she had moved them there years ago to escape Sarah's father, a man she described as a monster and a deadbeat who had tried to kidnap Sarah when she was a toddler. Martha claimed she had spent her life on the run, sacrificing her career, her relationships, and her own happiness to keep Sarah off the grid so that the father could never find them. This was the narrative Sarah had been fed since she was old enough to understand language. Her father was the bogeyman. The world outside their four walls was a minefield of predators and disease. Martha had homeschooled her, but it wasn't about education, it was about insulation. Sarah had no friends, no social media that Martha didn't monitor, and no bank account. She was a 24-year-old woman with the autonomy of a toddler. But here's what Martha didn't know. Sarah had found a way out, even if it was just through a cracked window. She had managed to hide an old smartphone that a neighbor had given her months ago. And through that phone, She had started talking to a guy named Mark. Now, in Martha's version of the story, Mark was a 35-year-old predator who was brainwashing her daughter. Martha told my team that Mark was probably a human trafficker. She was hysterical about it, but when my investigators looked into Mark, they found a 26-year-old guy working as a library assistant 3 towns over. He wasn't a predator. He was just a guy who had noticed a lonely girl online and realized something was very, very wrong. When Sarah and Mark started talking, the facade of Martha's world began to crumble. Mark started asking questions that Sarah couldn't answer. Questions like, why aren't you allowed to go to the grocery store alone? And why don't you have a birth certificate? When Sarah brought these questions to her mother, the protection turned into persecution. Martha would have heart attacks, imaginary ones. From what I could tell, every time Sarah tried to walk to the end of the driveway, she would tell Sarah that her father was closing in and that they had to move again. This is what we call enmeshment on steroids. It's a toxic cycle where the parent's identity is so tied up in being a savior that they actually need the child to be sick, weak, or threatened in order to feel like they have a purpose. Martha wasn't protecting Sarah from the world, she was protecting herself from the loneliness and the accountability of her own life. She had turned her daughter into an emotional prosthetic. The escalation reached a breaking point when Sarah finally tried to leave. She had packed a small bag and planned to meet Mark at a local diner. She didn't get 20 feet out the door before Martha collapsed on the porch, screaming that Sarah was killing her, that the stress of Sarah's betrayal was literally stopping her heart. It was a classic move, a guilt trip designed to paralyze, and it worked. Sarah stayed. She spent the next 3 days apologizing for wanting to breathe. That was when Martha called the show. She thought I would be her ultimate weapon. She thought I would sit there, look at Sarah, and tell her she was being a rebellious, ungrateful daughter who was throwing away a mother's love for a stranger. Martha wanted me to validate her delusion. She wanted me to tell Sarah that she was indeed too fragile for the world. But Martha made a fatal mistake. She forgot that my job isn't to validate her story. It's to find the truth. And the truth has a way of being very inconvenient for people like Martha. By the time they got to the studio, the tension between them was vibrating. You could feel it in the air. Martha was playing the part of the grieving, exhausted saint. Sarah was playing the part of the broken, confused patient. But as I sat there watching them, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Martha claimed Sarah had severe asthma that required her to stay indoors. Yet Sarah's lungs sounded perfectly clear and there wasn't an inhaler in sight. Martha claimed Sarah had chronic fainting spells, but when I asked for the name of the neurologist, Martha's memory suddenly became very fuzzy. I've spent a lot of years reading people, and Martha's body language was screaming. She was leaning over Sarah, literally overshadowing her, trying to control the narrative even through her posture. She was protecting her, all right? She was protecting the lie that gave her life meaning. And Sarah was starting to wake up. You could see it in the way she flinched when Martha touched her. You could see it in the way she looked at the exit signs in the studio. She wasn't sick. She was suffocating. I knew that in order to break this cycle, I had to do more than just talk. I had to expose the foundation of the lie. I had to go back to the very beginning, to the monster father and the escape, because if the origin story is a lie, then everything built on top of it is a lie too. And I had a feeling that the monster wasn't who Martha said he was. I had my team do some digging, and what we found was about to blow this protective mother's world wide open. I've seen a lot of parents who think they own their children. They treat them like an extension of their own ego, or worse, a shield against their own failures. Martha was the gold medalist in that department. When we finally walked out onto that stage, the air was thick with the kind of tension you could cut with a hacksaw. Martha was dressed in soft pastels, looking every bit the weary, devoted mother. Sarah was beside her, hunched over, looking like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. I started the show by letting Martha talk. I wanted the audience, and more importantly, I wanted Sarah to hear the absurdity of the narrative when it was played back in the cold light of day. Martha went on about the predators lurking in every corner of the internet. She spoke about Sarah's delicate constitution and how she had nursed her through countless nights of terror. She used words like broken and incapable to describe her own daughter as if she were talking about a piece of discarded machinery. While Martha was talking, I kept my eyes on Sarah. Every time Martha said something particularly diminishing, Sarah's shoulders would drop another inch. It was a physical manifestation of a spirit being crushed in real time. I waited for a lull in Martha's monologue, a moment where she paused to dab a dry eye with a tissue, and that's when I decided to shift the gears. Martha, I said, my voice low and steady, you've told us a lot about how dangerous the world is for Sarah. You've told us about the monster she's running from her father. You told my producers that he was a violent, unstable man who tried to snatch her away when she was 3 years old. Is that correct? Martha nodded vigorously. He was a nightmare, Dr. Phil. I had to change our names. I had to move us 6 times in 10 years. I've lived in fear every single day that he would find us and finish what he started. I looked over at Sarah. Sarah, is that what you believe? Do you remember your father being a monster? Sarah looked down at her lap, her voice barely a whisper. I don't remember him at all. But Mom told me. She told me he burned my crib. She told me he used to scream at the walls. She told me he was the reason I have these heart palpitations because of the trauma he caused me when I was a baby. This is where the protection becomes a poison. This mother hadn't just isolated her daughter, she had colonized her memory. She had implanted horrors into a child's mind to ensure that the child would never go looking for the truth. But the thing about the truth is, it's patient. It doesn't mind waiting 20 years to show up. Well, Martha, I said, leaning back and picking up a blue folder from the table next to my chair, we did some digging. My team spent the last 72 hours looking for this monster, and we found him. His name is David. And David hasn't been hiding in the shadows waiting to pounce. David has been in the same house in Ohio for 22 years. He's a retired firefighter. He has a clean record. And most importantly, he has a stack of court documents 3 inches thick showing that he spent 15 years and every cent of his retirement savings trying to find the daughter you abducted. The silence in the studio was like a physical weight. Martha's face didn't just turn pale, it turned a sort of grayish green. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just stared at the folder in my hand like it was a live grenade. Sarah, on the other hand, looked like she had been struck by lightning. She turned to her mother, her eyes wide, her mouth working, but no sound coming out. That's a lie, Martha finally hissed, her voice sounding like a cornered animal. He's a manipulator. He probably paid you to say that. He's dangerous, Sarah. Don't listen to him. Martha, I have the police reports, I said, my voice getting harder. I have the parental kidnapping warrants that were issued in 2003. I have the depositions from the neighbors who saw you drive away in the middle of the night while David was at work. I have the photos of the burned crib that the fire marshal says was actually just a small kitchen fire caused by a faulty toaster, an accident that David wasn't even home for. I turned to Sarah. This was the moment. This was the crack in the dam. Sarah, you've spent 24 years believing you were a victim of a monster, but the reality is the person you thought was protecting you is the person who stole your life. She didn't save you from a kidnapping, she committed one. She didn't protect you from the world. She hid you from the truth so you would never leave her side. Sarah was shaking now, a fine, violent tremor that started in her hands and moved up to her jaw. She looked at the screen behind me where we had a photo of David. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a tired, kind man with gray hair and the same shaped nose as Sarah. He was holding a picture of a 3-year-old girl. Martha started to do what people like her always do when the walls close in. She staged a medical emergency. She clutched her chest, her breathing became shallow and theatrical, and she started to slide out of her chair. My heart, Sarah, help me, my heart. In the past, Sarah would have been on the floor in seconds, sobbing and apologizing, letting the guilt pull her back into the cage. But something had changed. The one question I had asked her earlier, "What do you want?" was finally getting an answer. Sarah didn't move. She stayed in her chair, watching her mother's performance with a look of profound, agonizing clarity. "Sit up, Martha," I said, not moving from my spot. "The medics are backstage, and they've already told me your vitals were perfect 10 minutes ago. Your heart is fine. Your conscience might be under some stress, but your heart is pumping just fine. Stop the theater and look at your daughter." Martha stopped sliding. She realized the heart attack wasn't going to buy her an exit this time. She sat up, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The loving mother was gone. In her place was a woman who had been caught in a 20-year lie and had no intention of apologizing for it. "I did it for you," Martha screamed at Sarah. "You were too soft. You wouldn't have survived with him. He would have let you run wild. I gave you a life. I gave you safety." "You didn't give me a life, Mom," Sarah said, her voice finally finding its strength. It was low, but it was steady. "You gave me a prison. You told me I was sick, so I wouldn't leave. You told me my father was a killer, so I wouldn't go looking for him. You made me afraid of the sun. Mom, who does that to their child?" "I loved you," Martha shrieked. "No," I interrupted. "That's not love, Martha. That's ownership. Love is about preparing a child to leave you. Love is about giving them wings, not clipping them and telling them the sky is falling. You didn't love her, you used her. You used her to fill a hole in your own soul, and you didn't care if you destroyed her in the process." I turned back to Sarah. The escalation was reaching its peak. The confrontation wasn't just between her and her mother anymore. It was between Sarah and the person she thought she was. She had to decide right then and there if she was going to be the fragile girl or the woman who walked out of that studio into her own life. "Sarah," I said, "Mark is here. He's in the audience. He's been waiting to see if you're ready to stop being a ghost. And there's someone else here too. David is in a room just 20 feet from where we're sitting. He's waited 20 years to say hello. You don't have to go back to that house. You don't have to be sick anymore, but you have to be the one to stand up. I can open the door, but I can't make you walk through it." Sarah looked at the exit, then at Mark in the front row, then finally at the woman sitting next to her, the woman who had been her entire world, her only source of truth. Martha was whispering now, a hissed stream of consciousness, telling Sarah that I was a liar, that the man backstage was an imposter, that if Sarah left, she would die alone in a week. It was the ultimate test of psychological gravity. The pull of the lie was immense. It was 24 years of conditioning versus 10 minutes of truth. I watched Sarah's face, seeing the battle play out in the twitch of her eye and the clenching of her jaw. She was at the crossroads. "I'm not sick," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "Say it louder," I told her. "I'm not sick," she shouted, and this time she stood up. She pulled her hand away from Martha's reach with such force that Martha fell back against the sofa. "I'm not sick, and I'm not yours. You lied about everything. You lied about my dad. You lied about my heart. You're the one who's sick, Mom. You're the one who needs help." The audience erupted, but I stayed focused on Sarah. The breakthrough was happening, but the aftermath was where the real work would begin. Martha was now in full-blown hysterics, the kind of ugly crying that's meant to draw focus, but no one was looking at her. All eyes were on the young woman who was standing tall for the first time in her adult life. I watched Sarah stand there, her chest heaving, her eyes locked onto the exit. It was like watching a bird that had been in a cage so long it had forgotten what its wings were for, suddenly remembering the mechanics of flight. Martha was still on the floor, or rather, slumped against the side of the stage stairs, wailing about her broken heart and how ungrateful her daughter was. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, a final, desperate attempt to snatch back the leash. But the leash had snapped. You could see it in the way Sarah didn't even flinch at her mother's cries anymore. The sound that used to paralyze her with guilt was now just background noise, as hollow and empty as the lies that had built her life. I stepped down from my chair and walked over to Sarah. I didn't touch her. She'd had enough people grabbing at her and claiming ownership over her body. I just stood near her, a steady presence in the storm. I told her, "Take a breath, Sarah. Look at me. You're not dying. Your heart isn't failing. You're just feeling what it's like to be alive without permission for the first time in 20 years. It's scary, isn't it?" She nodded, tears finally starting to spill over, but these weren't the tears of a victim. They were the tears of someone who was finally mourning the childhood that had been stolen from her. I turned my attention back to Martha, who was looking up at us with a mixture of shock and calculating rage. I told her, "Martha, you need to get up. The performance is over. Nobody is buying the tickets anymore. You've spent 2 decades playing the martyr while you were actually the warden. You hijacked this girl's life because you were too afraid to face your own. You kidnapped her, you lied about her father, and you medically gaslit her into believing she was an invalid. That's not just bad parenting, that's psychological abuse. And it stops here. It stops right now on this stage." Martha tried one last time to pivot. She looked at the audience, her voice cracking. "I did it for her. Her father was a drunk. He was dangerous. I had to save her." I didn't even let her finish the sentence. I pulled out a document from the folder, a certified copy of David's military service record and his 20-year commendation from the fire department. "David has been a pillar of his community," I said, my voice echoing in the studio. "He has no criminal record. He has no history of substance abuse. The only danger he posed to you, Martha, was the fact that he was a good man who would have seen through your control tactics. You didn't run from a monster. You ran from a witness." I signaled to my producers to escort Martha backstage. She didn't go quietly. She was shouting as they led her away, telling Sarah she'd be back, telling her she'd regret this. But as the heavy soundproof doors closed behind her, a profound silence settled over the room. Sarah let out a long, shuddering breath. It was the sound of 20 years of held tension leaving a human body. She looked at me, and for the first time, she wasn't looking for a script. She was just looking for the truth. "Is he really here?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "He's right behind that door," I said. "But before you see him, I want you to understand something. You've been told a story about yourself for a long time. You've been told you're weak, that you're sick, that you can't survive on your own. That story was a lie designed to keep you small. You're going to have to do a lot of work to unlearn that. It's not going to happen in an hour. But the woman who just stood up to that monster on the floor, that woman is strong, that woman is capable. Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise again." We walked backstage together. Mark, the young man who had been her digital lifeline, was waiting in the hallway. When he saw Sarah, he didn't rush her. He just stood there, looking at her with a kind of respect that Martha had never shown her. Sarah walked up to him, and for the first time in her life, she initiated a hug. It wasn't the desperate cling of a child, it was the greeting of an equal. I stood back and let them have that moment. People often think I'm just about the gotcha moments on stage, but the real work happens in these quiet spaces where the reality of the change starts to sink in. Then it was time for the big one. We moved to a private room where David was waiting. My heart doesn't often race after all these years, but I felt the weight of this moment. You're talking about 20 years of missed birthdays, missed graduations, missed life. You're talking about a father who had grieved, a daughter who was still alive, and a daughter who had been taught to hate a man who loved her more than his own life. I opened the door and walked in first. David was standing by the window, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked older than the photos, his face lined with the kind of wear and tear that only comes from decades of searching and hoping. When he saw me, he stood up straighter. Is she? He started, but he couldn't finish the question. She's right here, David, I said. Sarah walked in behind me. She stopped about 5 feet away from him. They just stared at each other. It was like they were looking for pieces of themselves in the other person's face. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered photograph. It was the last picture he had taken of her, a blurry shot of a 3-year-old in a yellow sundress eating a popsicle. I never stopped looking, Sarah, David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I never stopped. I had a room for you in every house I lived in. I bought you a Christmas present every single year. They're all in a trunk in my attic. I didn't know where you were, but I knew you were out there. I just wanted you to know that I never gave up on you. Sarah didn't say anything at first. She just walked over and touched the photograph. Then she looked up at him, her eyes searching his. She told me you were dead, she said softly. Then she told me you were a monster. I grew up hating you because I thought you didn't want me. I wanted you more than anything in this world, David said, tears streaming down his face. I watched as they sat down together. It wasn't a movie ending. There were no soaring violins. It was awkward, it was painful, and it was raw. They had to navigate 20 years of silence. But the foundation was there. The truth had finally been spoken. And once the truth is out, you can't put it back in the bottle. Later that evening, after the cameras were packed away and the studio was dark, I sat in my office and looked over the case files one last time. Martha was currently in a hotel room, being monitored by our staff psychologist. She was still in denial, still blaming everyone but herself. She was a classic case of what happens when a person's need for control overrides their capacity for love. She had created a world where she was the hero and everyone else was a villain or a victim. Breaking that delusion is one of the hardest things in the world to do, and honestly, Martha might never break it, but Sarah did. Sarah and Mark left together that night, headed to a safe location we had arranged for her. She wasn't going back to Martha's house. She wasn't going back to the sick girl she used to be. She had a long road ahead of her therapy to deal with the trauma, medical checkups to prove to herself that her body wasn't failing, and the slow, difficult process of building a relationship with a father she didn't know. But for the first time in her life, she was the one behind the wheel. I've said it before and I'll say it again, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Martha refused to acknowledge her own brokenness, so she tried to break her daughter instead. But the human spirit is a lot more resilient than people give it credit for. You can bury the truth, you can hide it under layers of lies and fear, but it's like a seed. If you give it just a little bit of light and a little bit of room to breathe, it'll find a way to crack through the concrete. I sat in my dressing room after the show, the silence of the studio feeling heavy and thick. Usually, after a taping, there's a sense of closure, but this one felt different. It felt like we had just cracked open a tomb. I've seen thousands of cases, but the level of calculated, cold-blooded deception Martha had maintained for 2 decades was something that still sat heavy in my gut. I looked at the monitors, watching the security footage of Sarah and David sitting in the green room. They were still there, hours later, just talking. 2 strangers trying to bridge a 20-year canyon with nothing but a handful of words and a lifetime of what-ifs. People often ask me how a mother could do something like this. How could a woman who claims to love her child more than life itself systematically dismantle that child's reality? The answer isn't simple, but it's consistent. Martha was addicted to being a savior. In her mind, she wasn't the villain. She was the hero of a story she had written entirely for herself. She had what we call a need to be needed that had mutated into something predatory. To Martha, Sarah wasn't a daughter. She was a project. She was a permanent patient who provided Martha with a permanent purpose. Without a sick daughter to care for, Martha was just a middle-aged woman with a criminal record for kidnapping and no identity of her own. She couldn't handle that void, so she filled it with Sarah's potential. I've seen this dynamic before, where the parent uses care as a weapon of mass destruction. They create a sick role for the child, and the child, wanting to please the parent and survive in their only known environment, adopts that role. Sarah had spent years manifesting physical symptoms, the palpitations, the fainting, the exhaustion, because she had been told they were there. When you tell a child from the age of 3 that their heart is delicate, they start to interpret every normal spike in adrenaline, every flutter of excitement, as a sign of impending death. It's a form of physiological brainwashing. The next morning, I met with Sarah one last time before she left for a specialized treatment facility we had arranged. I wanted to see where her head was at now that the adrenaline of the stage had worn off. She looked different. She was wearing a sweater that wasn't one of the drab, oversized things Martha usually picked for her. She had her hair pulled back. She looked like a woman who was starting to inhabit her own skin. "How are you feeling, Sarah?" I asked her. "And give me the real answer, not the one you think I want to hear." She looked at me, and for the first time, her gaze was steady. "I'm terrified, Dr. Phil," she said. "For 20 years, I knew exactly who I was. I was the girl who couldn't leave the house. I was the girl who needed her mom for everything. Now, I don't know who I am. I don't even know what I like to eat for breakfast, because my mom always told me I was allergic to everything but oatmeal and toast." "That's the most honest thing I've heard all week," I told her. "You've been living in a script that someone else wrote. Now you've got a blank page." That's scary as hell, but it's also the greatest gift you've ever been given. You get to decide who Sarah is, not Martha, not me, not even David, just you. We talked about the unlearning process. I told her she was going to have emotional flashbacks. There would be times when she'd reach for the phone to call Martha, or times when she'd feel a twinge in her chest and panic, thinking her heart was failing. I explained to her that her brain had been wired for high alert survival for 20 years. You don't just rewire that in a weekend. It's a marathon, not a sprint. I also had to have a much tougher conversation with her about the legal side of things. Martha wasn't just going to go away. The local authorities in Ohio were already looking into the decades-old kidnapping warrant. There was a very real possibility that Martha would face criminal charges. I had to prepare Sarah for the fact that she might have to testify against the only person she had ever known as a protector. "I don't want her to go to jail," Sarah whispered, the old guilt flicking across her face like a shadow. She's still my mom. I leaned in, making sure she was looking at me. Sarah, listen to me. This is the hardest lesson you're going to learn. You can love someone and still recognize that they are a danger to your soul. Martha didn't just make a mistake. She stole your father. She stole your health. She stole your youth. If she faces consequences, those aren't things you are doing to her. Those are things she did to herself the moment she drove away with you 20 years ago. You are not responsible for her choices. You are only responsible for your recovery. While Sarah was preparing to leave, I went to see Martha. She was in a separate area of the building, still refusing to speak to our psychologist unless they agreed that I was tricking her daughter. When I walked into the room, she didn't look like the fragile, weeping mother from the stage. She looked cold. She looked like a general who had lost a battle but was already planning the next insurgency. You've destroyed her, Martha said, before I could even sit down. She's out there with that man. He'll hurt her, and it'll be on your head. She's too weak for the world, and you've thrown her to the wolves. No, Martha, I said, my voice flat. I've taken her out of the cage. The only wolf in her life was the woman who told her she couldn't walk, so she wouldn't run away. You didn't do this for her. You did this because you were a lonely, bitter woman who wanted a doll that would never grow up. But guess what? The doll just woke up, and she's never coming back to your playhouse. Martha didn't have a response for that. She just turned her head and stared at the wall. It was the ultimate shutdown. People like Martha don't change because they don't believe they've done anything wrong. In her mind, the fact that she fed and clothed Sarah for 20 years canceled out the fact that she had psychologically maimed her. It's a distorted ledger that never balances. Before they left, I saw David and Sarah standing by the car. David was hesitant, still unsure of how much space to give her. He was a man who had been through the ringer years of private investigators, years of dead ends, years of being told by the police that his daughter was likely gone forever. He looked like he was afraid that if he blinked, she'd disappear again. I walked over and shook his hand. Give it time, David, I told him. Don't try to make up for 20 years in 20 days. Just be there. Be the steady ground she hasn't had. He nodded, his eyes wet. I'm just glad I get to see her breathe, Dr. Phil. I don't care if she never calls me Dad. I just want to know she's okay. As the car pulled away, I stayed there on the curb for a minute. This job, it takes a lot out of you. People see the lights and the audience and the advice. But what they don't see is the wreckage we have to sift through to find a single spark of hope. Sarah was one of the lucky ones. She had found a way to reach out before the lies completely smothered her. She had found Mark, a young man who was brave enough to tell her that her normal wasn't normal at all, and she had been brave enough to believe him. That one question I asked her, what do you want? It's the most dangerous question in the world for someone living in a lie, because the moment you answer it, the lie starts to die. Sarah wanted to live. She wanted to breathe. She wanted to know her father. And once she acknowledged those wants, Martha's power over her began to evaporate like mist in the sun. I walked back into the studio. The crew was already breaking down the set for the next show. It's a conveyor belt of human drama. I know that. But as I headed to my car, I couldn't help but think about that trunk in David's attic. 20 years of Christmas presents. 20 years of I love you cards addressed to a ghost. Today, that ghost became a woman. And that right there is why I still show up to work every morning. The work didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. In fact, for Sarah, that's when the hardest part began. We followed up with her over the next few months while she was at the specialized residential center we provided. It was a facility that dealt specifically with victims of high-control domestic environments and medical gaslighting. I remember getting a call from her lead therapist about 6 weeks in. She told me that Sarah had experienced a massive panic attack the first time she was asked to walk to a local park by herself. Not because she was afraid of predators, but because her brain was still screaming that her heart would stop if she exerted herself without her mother there to monitor her pulse. That is the legacy of a lie. It lives in the nervous system long after the liar has been removed from the room. But then, about 3 months after the show, I got a video message from Sarah. She was standing in the middle of a crowded grocery store. She looked a little overwhelmed, but she was smiling. She held up a container of strawberries and told the camera, "Doctor, Phil, I just ate these. My mom told me I was deathly allergic to berries since I was 4 years old. I just had the allergy test done at the clinic. I'm not allergic to anything. I've been missing out on strawberries for 20 years for no reason." It sounds like a small thing, but for a woman who had been denied the basic autonomy of her own palate, it was a revolution. It was the taste of freedom. The medical team at the center did a full workup on her stress tests, EKGs, blood panels, the works. The results were exactly what I suspected. Sarah didn't have a fragile heart. She didn't have chronic fatigue syndrome. She had a perfectly healthy, resilient body that had been suppressed by a state of constant, low-level terror. The only thing wrong with her was that she had been living in a psychological straitjacket. Once she started exercising and eating a normal diet, the palpitations vanished. They weren't heart disease, they were anxiety attacks. Martha had been treating the symptoms of the fear she was causing and calling it care. As for Martha, the legal system eventually caught up with the story. The authorities in Ohio reopened the case of the 2003 disappearance. When you take a child across state lines and hide them under a false identity to deprive a custodial parent of their rights, that's a felony. Martha tried to play the medical card again, claiming she was too ill to stand trial, but the court-appointed doctors didn't see it her way. She eventually took a plea deal that involved a suspended sentence and mandatory psychiatric counseling under the condition that she have no contact with Sarah for at least 5 years. I checked in on David too. He's been a rock. He didn't push Sarah to be his perfect daughter right away. He understood that he was a stranger to her despite the biological bond. He started sending her letters, real, handwritten letters, telling her about her grandparents, about the family history she'd been denied, and about the dog he has that he thinks she'd like. They started having dinner once a week. Sarah told me that the most healing part wasn't the big conversations. It was just sitting in a room with a man who didn't want anything from her, who didn't need her to be sick to feel important. David just wanted her to exist. And then there's Mark. That young library assistant turned out to be exactly who he said he was. He didn't try to save her in a way that created a new dependency. He stayed in his lane, offering her a friendship that was grounded in reality. They're taking things slow, which is exactly what I advised. Sarah needs to learn how to be a person before she can learn how to be a partner. She needs to know what it's like to have a bad day and not think it's a medical emergency. She needs to learn that she can disagree with someone and not be abandoned. Looking back on this case, it serves as a powerful, albeit painful, reminder of what happens when we let our own needs masquerade as love. Martha convinced herself she was a saint because the alternative, admitting she was a kidnapper and a liar, was too much for her ego to bear. She chose her own comfort over her daughter's life. And while that's an extreme example, I see versions of it every day. I see parents who won't let their kids fail, parents who live through their children's achievements, and parents who use guilt to keep their adult children from moving away. It's all the same poison, just in different dosages. The one question I asked Sarah, "What do you want?" is a question every person needs to ask themselves when they feel stuck. If your answer is always, I want to make so-and-so happy, or I want to avoid a conflict, then you aren't living your life, you're managing someone else's. Real life begins on the other side of that realization. It begins when you realize that you are the only person who can define your capacity. Sarah is 25 now. She recently sent me a photo of her first driver's license. She's grinning in the picture, and for the first time, her eyes don't look like they're searching for an exit. They look like they've arrived. She's working part-time at a local nursery, tending to plants. She told me she likes it because plants don't lie. They tell you exactly what they need: water, sun, and room to grow. If you give them that, they thrive. If you crowd them or starve them of light, they wither. She's finally in the sun, and she's thriving. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've learned that you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. But once you do acknowledge it, once you look the truth in the eye and call it by its name, the power of the lie is broken. Martha's house was built on sand, and it took 20 years for the tide to come in. But when it did, the truth washed everything away and left behind a foundation that Sarah could finally build on. It wasn't an easy journey, and it wasn't a pretty one, but it was a real one. And in this business, the real is the only thing that lasts. You don't have to be a victim of your history. You can be the architect of your future. You just have to be brave enough to ask the right questions and honest enough to hear the answers.